All right, well, let's go ahead and please take your seats. We're going to start this next panel. If you can please take your seats. So this panel will be moderated by a nationally recognized and admired transpartisan leader, Mark Gerzon, who will focus on how Americans can come together after such a divisive national election. So I think the panel that we just concluded talked a lot about some of the reactions and emotions that people are having after a very divisive national election. This panel will focus on, I think, what comes next and how we move forward as a country and as a community. What are the next steps for us? Following the panel discussion, I would add, I think we couldn't have a better moderator here with Mark Gerzon and his book, which is on my reading list, The Reunited States of America, and couldn't be more timely, that book, and should be a Bible for everyone in the room as we look to come together as a country. And following the panel discussion, Liz Joyner, who's the founder of the Village Square Movement, and John Blades, founder of Living Room Conversations, and John Steiner, co-founder of the Bridge Alliance and National Citizen Summit, and a leader in other transpartisan initiatives, and a good friend of mine, John, will reflect on the panelists' comments. So again, Mark Gerzon is our leading speaker, an author, and a consultant regarding the importance of inclusive, civil, compassionate, and collaborative democracy in America and the world. Our panelists, if I can introduce them, our Catholic Community Services Immigration and Refugee Resettlement Director, Aidan Battar, and a great leader in our community for our inclusive communities and making sure that our refugee and immigrant communities are included and afforded the opportunities. And so we look forward to hearing his thoughts on what's next. We have Natalie Gochner, the Associate Dean in the David Eccles School of Business and Director of the Kim C. Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah. Natalie, welcome. We have former Salt Lake City Mayor and National League of Cities President Ralph Becker, and also a great leader in bringing people together, and many examples in his public service, also as a friend, mentor, and former boss of mine. You aren't former friend or former mentor, but you are a former boss. Okay. And lastly, Utah State Senate President Wayne Niederhauser, who I had the privilege of serving with when I was in the State Senate, and I can attest as someone who is also very inclusive. As I was a Democrat in the State Senate, and I often joke that when you talk about the other side of the aisle, well, the other side of the aisle is also Republican in Utah. So when you say working with the other side of the aisle, I have to say working with the other side back row of the aisle. But he was very inclusive and very great to work with the other side back row and allow really, and we felt when they didn't need any Democratic vote to come together, we were very included in the debates, and I would say legislation usually reflected input from the minority caucus in the State Senate, and that's thanks to leadership like Senate President Wayne Niederhauser. So we have a great panel today.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and thank all those who are watching this elsewhere in the country on live stream. Welcome to this conversation to learn from our four panelists about the state of Utah, what's going on here, and what's possible for America. And I'm really delighted to have all of you with us, and the mayor did a beautiful job of introducing you, but I'd love to just ask each of you to say a word more about what is it that, here you are on a panel in Salt Lake City in 2016, less than a week after the election, commenting on and exploring what's next. I know there's probably a reason in your backgrounds why you're on this stage and why you care about this enough to do this on your Saturday afternoon. Could each of you just tell us something we don't know about yourself? Aidan, start with you. Tell us something about yourself that here you are talking about what we can do after this very divisive and challenging election. Why are you on the stage? What's happened in your life that makes you someone who we should all listen to?
Well, I came to Utah in 1994 as a refugee from Somalia. I left persecution, I left discrimination, all kind of difficulties a human being can go through. And when I came to the United States, I was only looking one thing, which is a safe place, a place where I can exercise my rights. I've never voted in my life when I was in Somalia. In the United States was the country that I felt that will give me that opportunity that I can exercise my right to vote. So as many other refugees, more than 3 million refugees were resettled in the United States to come to this land of freedom. And they were hoping that a lot from this country. But I think when we elect a president that have said so many things that hurted that many people, we're really in shock. I mean, and I represent that shock to many other refugees that are coming to us and saying, what is next for us? All we could tell them was that, let's see. We heard what the president-elect said, but let's see his actions, whether that's going to change or not. But I think we're hoping that freedom still exists for us, for everybody in the United States, that we could exercise our rights, and also that we're all inclusive. Because I feel that, in the United States is the place that gives everybody that opportunity to be included, not to be exclusive. I think now we're feeling that we're not part of the community here. I think it is very shameful that many people feel that way, but we have to see what happens next.
Thank you, Aidan. And Natalie, you're the only one on the panel who's in a university setting. So as you talk about your own past, talk a little bit too, just about what's it like being in a university setting week after this election.
Okay, great. Well, pleasure to be with you. I think I'm on the panel for a variety of reasons. I'm not sure, but I run a public policy institute that serves our state. So I spend all of my days looking at data and reading and doing research that helps this community prosper. I'm also a Republican. I'm also a woman, and I'm also LDS. And that might have something to do with the composition of the panel, and hope I can contribute in those ways. You asked a really specific question about the university setting. I'm new to the university setting. I've only been at the University of Utah 3 years, and it's been very eye-opening to me to see the reaction to this election. And I'll just be really honest. It was as if someone had passed away. The university has been in shock, the interactions I've had. I've talked to faculty members that had people on the TRAX train that were coming to class but were in tears and didn't think they could get there. I've had a call from the president's office that concerned we need to figure out how we help with the Muslim community on campus and all of our foreign students on campus. Can you get us to Mike Levitt to help us understand how the transition works? And so that was eye-opening to me to see that sort of flavor and sentiment. One last thing, you asked to share something that people may not know. I'm the youngest of 11 children, and I have 7 older brothers. So maybe there's something I can contribute to civility and compassion and productivity, because it's really been formative in my life.
Have you asked the other 10 how they voted?
My husband asked me, and when you have 11, there's a lot of variety, and so I'm sure we got a little bit of everything.
I'm here because I was asked, and it was an honor to be asked. I knew the people who are involved in putting this together and their intentions, and I knew some of the folks who were being asked to be involved, and I thought it would be a privilege to be part of it. What's next? I don't know. I'm not sure anybody knows. Maybe somebody does, but I hear that sort of questioning, that uncertainty, everywhere I hear or see people. This is as revolutionary an election as my lifetime, in the conduct of it, in the lack of discussion around the issues of our day, and in just the way it unfolded. And so I think all of us maybe had different thoughts about who we wanted to see get elected, but I think most of us were just shocked by the outcome. So as was said in an earlier panel, and it was such a wonderful panel and discussion earlier, I think when this was being formed, I thought, oh, we're going to talk about the issues of the day. That's not where people are today. People are wondering, what is our future? And maybe some people are looking at that more hopefully than others, and with a better sense of what that looks like. But I'm still in a state maybe that's a little bit numb, and a little and very uncertain. And just because of my background as someone who's always been involved in looking for solutions to problems or to issues or to satisfy people's aspirations in my career, both politically and outside of politics, I immediately turned to, well, how do we kind of reconstruct a civil dialogue and a civic discussion to move us forward? So I keep trying to turn my thoughts to that.
Thank you. Wayne, as president of the Utah Senate, you must be sitting in this from an absolutely front seat row. How does it look to you?
Well, we weren't, I think here in Utah, we weren't excited about any of the prospects in the presidential race. The Republican Party landed on Ted Cruz. That was their favored candidate. And then, of course, Donald Trump won the nomination back in Cleveland. And I think many of the Republicans have gotten behind that nomination here in the state of Utah. Maybe not so much as they did with Romney 4 years ago. I think the numbers would show that. The reason why I'm probably here today is even though I'm pretty conservative, have pretty conservative views, as Senate President, I feel like we can't make voices irrelevant. And so I've reached out to the minority party in the Senate. We have 5 out of 29 that are Democrat. And so, you know, they can easily become irrelevant in our discussions. But I've chosen to encourage their voice and to speak out on the issues. And while sometimes we get upset at each other for what we say in a committee or on the floor of the Senate, we need to be patient with one another and respect that there are differing views. And so I think there are people out there that if Mrs. Clinton would have gotten elected, may have had the same kind of feeling that what are we going to, how are our views going to be represented, how, and had some similar concerns. And I ask you, if you're here today, if the election would have gone another way, would you be here? Would you be involved in this discussion? Because this was a very divisive election. And it goes to show, I think, that there's a lot of lack of respect for each other in the public. I was watching today just a YouTube video that my son was showing me. A guy was interviewing people on both sides of this, on the presidential election, and asking them, "Can you say something good about Ms. Clinton?" to the Trump supporters. They wouldn't say anything good. Oh, her hair. And then on the other side, can you say anything good about Trump? Nothing. They wouldn't say anything good about Trump. And his hair. That's what it was. It was amazing. It was that we can say that their hair's nice. So, but that's a little bit, that's pretty shallow, right? So anyway, it's really kind of troubling to me. And so I agreed to come here today because I think I've shown that we can reach across different ideas and listen to each other and respect one another even though we disagree. And thankfully, folks, we have a system of government that has checks and balances. So no matter who gets in office in some spot, there's a check and a balance somewhere. And we don't need to be in complete despair if our candidate didn't get in. and support that we have a government that has those fail stops, and work to strengthen those. And I'm just going to put a plug here because I know I should be over. But one of those fail-safes is the states. The original founders said that the states would be another check and balance on a central government that they didn't want to get out of control. And so I asked the question, are we addressing too many things on a central level? Right. And maybe some of those things need to come back to the states for discussion? Question.
Wayne, that's a perfect segue to really talking about what's going on in Utah that's exciting. And I'm very glad to be in this state, as opposed to the other 49, because after a few years of trying to find a state or a city that really wanted to have an event that really sort of spearheaded what we're calling a citizen summit, this is the city that's done it. And it's happened in Utah, I think, for a reason. And so I have a lot to learn from all of you. I think everybody participating has a lot to learn. So let's go straight into this question of what we can learn as we move ahead. And I'd like to sort of suggest, think of these phrases: a new beginning, a fresh start, square one, a new day. This is certainly a new administration, a new time. Where do you see the possibilities of a fresh start or a new beginning or a new day? Where would you begin if you could wave your magic wand and say, here's something really exciting that could happen on the local level or in a state legislature or in faith institutions or at a university? Give us a couple of sparks, or what used to be called points of light back in the George H.W. Bush day. Tell us a couple of points of light from the state of Utah that you think might help illumine this moment. Who wants to begin? Natalie.
May we go to the federal level on this question,
Sure.
if it's okay? So here's the spark of light I'd love to see. If you're a Republican like I am, we were really disappointed when the Affordable Care Act passed and not a single Republican crossed over, and shame on the Republicans for that, but also shame on the Democrats for getting so divisive. So now you have just a complete opposite situation. Now the Republicans have the House, Senate, and the administration, and we know that the Affordable Care Act is going to be looked at very closely. I would love to see my fellow Republicans create an environment to be real change and compromise. I use the term avoid a lonely victory. So one of the sparks of light that I could see is if, and we saw some of it, this week, right, with the president-elect giving his interview to the Wall Street Journal and saying, some parts of Obamacare I like. And so that would be a spark of light to me to see us kind of saying, Americans need health care coverage. Pre-existing conditions have been a problem. It's not all the insurance company's fault. We have a bloated system. We got to figure it out. I would love to see something there.
Thank you. Other points of light, other new beginnings. Aiden.
Well, as an organization of faith that helps those that are in need the most, I think our concern is that, and we would like to see, is that our doors are not being closed. I think that's what the biggest concern that we have, and that we would like to see that the new administration to continue to do what America stands for, that we are a nation of immigrants. This country is built by immigrants. We would like to see that those millions of immigrants, undocumented, that are in our country, be given a path to citizenship. We would like to see that the refugees who are fleeing persecution being allowed to come to our country, regardless of their, backgrounds, whether they are Muslim, non-Muslim, because as long as they fit the definition of a refugee, they need to be allowed to come to the United States. I think that's what we would like to see happening. And also we would like to see a comprehensive immigration law being passed, which has the bipartisan support between the two parties, because that is a long overdue. And instead of building a wall, we would like to build bridges that will bring people together. That's what I would like to see happening.
Well, I can give you a couple of examples, just some legislation that has been passed over the years in the state legislature. And, I know many of you probably bemoan some of the things that we do up there, and you kind of wonder what we're doing during the legislative session. But everybody needs to understand that a legislative body is a body that receives ideas, and they come from a spectrum of folks in our society, and we have to accept them and debate them. And I often have constituents say, why are you even talking about that? That's the dumbest idea I've ever seen. But at least somebody thought it was a decent idea and got a sponsor to sponsor it. And there's ways for us to deal with that issue, but we have to deal with it. And that's the beauty of our system. It gives people an opportunity to bring ideas, and we debate them. And if we don't like them, we say no. And there's some hard feelings and sometimes despair because your issue didn't get passed. But let's take immigration, for example. Utah created some tremendous model language, or model policy a couple of years ago with immigration, giving pathway to citizenship. We passed that legislation, I think it was in 2010 or 2011, I can't remember exact year.
6 years ago.
Yeah, but that was in this world of polarization and in the different states, depending on who's in control, conservatives or liberals are in control of states. It was a coming together, and it was viewed as, wow, amazing. And at least, sometimes Utah is viewed as backwoods by people from other parts of the country, and that we're not up to speed with different ideas, and that we're backwards and that type of thing. But when you really look at what we do sometimes, it's amazing what solutions that we come up with, and they can be a model for our country. And again, I have to put the plug in for the states, because that's where a lot of these ideas start, is in the states, and we need to empower states to come up with ideas. The other one was Senate Bill 296 2 years ago, the LGBT Religious Liberties Bill. There was a coming together like no other coming together in this country on that issue. And there was a recognition that there's fairness for all with regards to housing and employment, and that there's also a strengthening of religious liberties, of how people feel and have felt for thousands of years, and base their religion on that. And that is, it's not one side needs to prevail over the other. We all have to come together and realize that there's some different ideas, that there's some different faiths, and accept that, as long as you have a certain amount of fundamental rights and can exercise those rights. So I think that's, I think we've been an example of that in those two major ways.
Right. So when the legislature did that and passed two pieces of legislation that you think the rest of the country could learn from, did you get inquiries from other states about those two bills, and did they start calling and saying, how did you work that through? And
Senator Adams, who is the sponsor of Senate Bill 296 2 years ago, has been all over the country. There is a ton of interest. How did you get that done in Utah? And I think especially for red states, this is a way, because you've seen what's happened in North Carolina. You saw what happened in Kansas several years ago, in Arizona. This is a very divisive issue. And it wasn't a blip on the radar screen here. It didn't create hardly any controversy, because it was a coming together. It was a meeting of the minds. It was an acceptance that there needs to be some respect and a certain level of fundamental rights for everybody. And again, I know Senator Adams has been in Ohio the last little while trying to help them with the issue, but a lot of these states can't seem to get where we got. And I think it's because of our culture. I think it's of who we are. We look for solutions to things.
Well, this captures for me why this Citizen Summit is happening in the state of Utah, because I feel there's lessons to be learned around the country from this state, probably lessons to be learned from other states. But I'd like to hear more about that feeling of innovation and possibility that's happening here. What else do you want the country to know is happening here? Because you see it as a point of light or as a possibility. Ralph?
Yeah, so let me add to this discussion. I hope, Natalie, what you said is right about the federal government. For years, I've worked with and gone back there and talked to people, and the obtuse nature of the discussions hasn't given me a lot of confidence. What does give me confidence is really that now we do have a one-party federal government, and now that party has to be accountable. And maybe it will force a discussion of a practical way to address an issue like healthcare. The state level, I think, has been hit or miss, and those are two wonderful examples, I think, that reflect. I didn't appreciate this for a very long time, but this almost unique ability of people in Utah to talk to one another with solutions as an objective. And I guess the way I would turn this in terms of a light going forward, and some of this has been on the discussion that's been happening earlier today, is it happens to an amazing degree at the local and regional level. Having regional government is an abhorrent idea in Utah. And yet we have some of the strongest regional decision-making anywhere in this state. Envision Utah, which is something that started under a different name even, Coalition for Utah's Future, back in the 80s, and became Envision Utah around what should our future be, how does it compare to our future today, what are our alternatives, and then what do people want, trying to merge and coalesce around what that future should look like, and was citizen-based. The initial effort pre-internet basically had 20,000 people involved. This last version of it had over 50,000 people involved, and all levels of government and private and public sectors fully engaged. And it has allowed Utah to make decisions around infrastructure, for example, that is the envy of what we see around the country when it comes to transportation, for example. It was that thinking of what do we want that's not necessarily where we're headed if we continue on the path today. And that was from the ground up. And I look at local governments as a mayor and as someone who met regularly with local government officials around the country. We were astounded by the way discussions were happening at the federal level and in most cases at the state level that were so entrenched in partisan ideology or petty discussions. When you're at the local level, you've got to get stuff done. You know, if people's garbage doesn't get picked up, they don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican or what your ideology is. And that attitude sort of grounds us, you know. We've got to balance the budget. We've got to deliver regardless of what a state hands down to us in terms of our ability to raise revenues. We've got to figure out how to do it. That sort of practicality, and then I'd say the ability of citizens, of people we've been hearing from today, and I'm seeing all across the country in the little bits and pieces that don't get the media attention because they're not fervent protests. Through this year and in the immediate aftermath even of this election is what gives me a sense of hope that, you know what, we as a people are better than what we saw this year in national politics. And we can do this, and we have to do it.
Thank you. Aidan, did you want to add something?
I just want to say quickly that great things that we do here in Utah. And I always take an example of the work that I do. In the refugee resettlement world, public-private partnership is a very important role for us. And I think Utah, we do much, much better than the rest of the nation, especially when the church is when the religious organization coming together to work together, we could achieve a lot. Before the 1980 and when the Refugee Act was passed, it was the religious organizations who started bringing those that were fleeing persecution. That 3 million refugees that I mentioned earlier would not have been possible if the religious organizations would not have been in the forefront in helping. And I think in Utah, when the first presidency of the LDS Church sent out a letter to all the members of the LDS faith and said, get involved with the refugees in your neighborhood. What strong message would that, better the message than that be in our community? I would like to see that our leaders doing the similar thing, saying, reach out to those in your neighborhood that are in need, whether they immigrant, refugees, or those that are need to give our hand, to lift them up. I think in Utah we do great, and we need to be proud of that as well.
Thank you. I'd like to hear you talk more about some of the possibilities here looking ahead, that this is a laboratory of democracy. As Wayne was saying, the state is one of those other levels of government. In addition to the judicial and legislative and the executive, they're the states. It's almost like this. So there's 50 possibilities for breaking through this polarization. What are some of the ways that you think Utah is leading the way or could lead the way in terms of breaking through this polarization? You obviously have Democrats and Republicans coming to the state nationally trying to get you to side with them and turn red or turn blue on the map. And I guess I'm curious as a Coloradan who's come across the Rocky Mountains to visit you, I'm just curious, is there a possibility that the state of Utah could say, hey, we're not going to do your red-blue game. We're going to look out for Utah. We're going to make Utah unique. And here's how we'd like to do it. I'd love to hear some of you just dream a little bit about what that might look like.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think we've done a lot of great things, and there's a lot of potential here. But even the things we come up are going to be of a pinkish color. I mean, that's a reality. And so blue states are probably not going to look at what we've done with regards to LGBT religious liberties as something that they want to do. But there was some elements of that really could be a help to any state legislature who is grappling with those very basic rights for people, no matter who they are. And but again, I have to say that we're going to side probably a little bit on the red side, but we can be an example for a lot of the other red states out there on solutions. Hey, Utah, one of the most Republican states in the country, was able to pass immigration reform, which was struck down by courts federally because that's something that the federal government feels like is their responsibility. But yet we had come up with a model that the federal government maybe could take and see if that could be a solution. And I think the mayor, former mayor, Mayor Becker here, brings out, I think, some good points, is that we have a tendency to want to dialogue and have respect for each other. And I have to say, one of the things that really I'm troubled with quite a bit with this past election, and there was a lot, by the way, but just one of the ideas, and I think about this for a minute. The polls were saying that a certain education level was voting for a certain candidate, and a certain education level was voting for a certain candidate. Or in other words, if you're dumb, you're voting for Donald Trump, and if you're smart, you're voting for Hillary Clinton. And I think that is the wrong way to start a dialogue of coming together. That because I'm smart and I've got all this education, I'm somehow now have a dispensation on the way things should be. And maybe that's part of the reason why we had the surprise night the other night.
Yeah.
People came out of the woodwork. There was legislators I was talking to in North Carolina. North Carolina was predicted by 5 points or more to go Democrat and to vote for Hillary Clinton. And my colleague there was telling me, no, it's not happening. People are coming out of the woodwork and voting like they've never voted before people that felt like their voice now was being heard, and for good or ill. I know there's some debate about that, but we have to not just think, well, we're the educated people, we're the ones that are going to rule, and you just have to follow what we want to do. We have to reach out to people of all education levels, of all races, of all genders, and get their ideas and bring them into the dialogue. And that's best to take place at the city level and at the state level, instead of a government 2,000 miles away. And you like it when it's your issue that's being discussed back there and wins, but when it's not yours or your president doesn't win, you don't like it anymore. And that ebbs and flows. So let's make a concerted effort to avoid this one-size, top-down control approach that we get from Washington, D.C., and bring it back to the states. Bring it back to the cities, where we can effectively make those policies and make them in a way that works for the people in that community, because not every community are the same, and we want to be able to do it our way, as long as a certain level of people's rights are not imposed upon or diminished.
I want to add to the discussion as well the impact that the business community have, and I think that's something that other states can learn from us. We have a very engaged business community in Utah. They're very informed, and if you look at some of the things that we're most proud of as a community, let's look at our rail network. We put in 70 miles of rail in 7 years, and a lot of people contributed to that. But the ballot initiative that paid for that was led through the Salt Lake Chamber, the state's largest business association. So they campaigned to get it on the ballot, then they raised all the money to go take it to the public, and then it happened. And that's an example. Usually a business community would be against a tax increase during a time of prosperity and surplus, which it was. Mm-hmm. And yet the business community saw a window to do something great to help our state, and they made it happen. One other example, we've mentioned the immigration legislation and immigration reform in this state. The Utah Compact, which has been so heralded as a document that helped bring this community together, that was crafted within the walls of a business association. So business communities aren't perfect, and you may disagree with them in some places, but and Envision Utah, by the way, would be the same, wouldn't it, Ralph, that the business community helped support that. So if you have an engaged and informed business community, you can make good things happen.
Say more about Utah Compact for those who are listening from out of state.
Sure. It's 5 principles to guide an immigration discussion, and we're thinking it was about in 2006, if our numbers are about right. Sorry, 2010, excuse me. That was going 6 years ago. And you can go to utahcompact.com and see it, but
Thank you.
But it represented the things that people care about in this community when it comes to immigration.
Ralph, you wanted to add a word, and I'd like to hear somebody with a kind of a blue background talk about how you feel about this pinkish hue.
Well, if there's one thing that it teaches those of us who are in the political minority, it is that you do not get things done alone in a state where there's a conservative majority. And when you're at the local level, I was in the state legislature for 11 years, and President Niederhauer's, there was always an example of including people and bringing people in. But when you're in the minority, you do not set the agenda. You look for opportunities to try to influence outcomes. And you do your best to be a voice that you think needs to be well represented and that reflects you and people you represent. But I guess I would say that part of it is having a state be respectful of local governments. It is a mantra in the Republican Party. We believe in states, we believe in local decision making, but we find the same thing at the local level. If we do something that is contrary to the prevailing view at the state level every time that someone at the state, and fortunately in my time in office, it seldom was successful, wants to overturn the local decision making. Well, this is nothing new to all of us in Utah, but Salt Lake City is very different than the rest of the state politically, and our values and our population, our demographics. And I can tell you, and Ben McAdams, who is now the county mayor, who worked with me, and our whole team, from the beginning we took on an issue that we knew was important and maybe would be groundbreaking for the state and even for the city. We factored in, how are we going to deal with folks at the state trying to overturn what is important to us and represents an important value for us. And the only way I can tell you we were able to do it was by going to people like President Niederhauser and others from the very beginning of the conversation and saying, look, this is going to be controversial. Here is what we are trying to do and why we're trying to do it. We want you to respect us in terms of it being what our community wants. And we want to hear what you believe. And we'll try to come up with something that hopefully can withstand your scrutiny and those who find abhorrent what Salt Lake City wants to do. Just like some people at the national level find it abhorrent what the state of Utah wants to do, right? But you know what? We were able to, in almost all cases, do that. But it is hard work, and it is painstakingly slow. But that's at least sort of a key to the way we were able to kind of weave our way through what we knew was really important in terms of the values and objectives of our community in respecting people and achieving an environmental protection and giving people greater opportunities, whether they were kids or people who are disadvantaged or refugees, was to bring it forward, but do it much slower than we would if it was just our community.
Well, as I'm sitting here looking across this end of the stage, and I'm an outsider of the state of Utah, what I'm seeing is a reddish politician and a bluish politician, and I don't know about you, but I can feel this level of trust and respect between these two men. And I feel that between all four of you. And I think that's what I'm feeling more than any piece of legislation or any particular innovation. What I'm feeling is a sense of respect and collaboration and dialogue between the folks here on the stage. And I guess that's the magic sauce I'd like you to talk a little bit about, because that clearly that magic sauce seems to be missing at the national level. And I know for a fact that it's missing in other states. So can you talk about, as chefs or as cooks, what's in that magic sauce? What makes that magic sauce work?
I think it's respect. These two are friends of mine, but I know that they have a lot of respect for one another, and they've come from different backgrounds. Mayor Becker came from Washington, D.C., came to our state, fell in love with it, and has devoted so much of his life to public service. And I think Senator Niederhauser sees that and respects it and works from there. And I think likewise, I should let them talk for themselves.
No, you're doing a good job.
As an observer. Well, as an observer. Yeah. Well, that's well. This is another thing. See, they're both backcountry skiers, and they share this love for Mother Earth and for the beauty of this state. And I think always compromise and problem solving starts with you respecting the life experience that got someone who thinks differently than you do.
Well, and I'm also feeling, as I'm sitting next to Aiden, I'm feeling, you moved here from Somalia. You came here on purpose. Not 2,000 miles from Washington, but 20,000 miles. And as you listen to this, isn't that kind of why you came here, with this kind of collaboration and respect? Because I've worked in East Africa for the UN. I know what it's like in Somalia and Kenya and the Congo and other places where there's some tough and undemocratic institutions there. And is this one of the things that drew you here? Do you still have that sense of hope and excitement that you had when you first came?
Absolutely. I think that's what many refugees who came to Utah feel the same way. Over 60,000 refugees live in Utah and feel the same way. And another good thing is that, like when last year, when about 27 governors said that they would not welcome Muslim refugees into their states. Those of us who work with the refugee, we reach out to our governor's office and said, I think Utah is better than that. And our governor immediately stood up and said, Utah will welcome any refugee, regardless of their background. And I think we feel that, we could reach out to our political leaders. They would listen to us. And we have that voice. We could reach out to them and express our concerns, and knowingly that we would be listened to. And I think you don't have that everywhere. And we are blessed to live to Utah. And when I first arrived, I never second thought that, I said, this is home. This is the place.
Well, and I'm struck too that for the rest of the country, this state, you say Utah, people think Mormon. You say Utah, they think Mormon. And I really want to ask you, what's the role of religion and faith in the fact that this state has, I'm sure for good and for ill, but it has a very powerful religious base right at the center of the culture. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's part of the sauce. Again, it's part of the magic sauce and also part of the challenge, I'm sure. But could one of you address that?
I'll do real quickly, and then I think there'll be others to add. But this is a tough topic, okay? But I'll try my best. So I'm LDS, and at the center of my faith is the concept of how we treat others. And a famous Mormon scripture has this terminology, aren't we all beggars? And Mormons are imperfect and all sorts of things that are not right sometimes in the way we conduct ourselves, but our core doctrine in so many places is a beautiful expression of loving your neighbor and that we are all beggars. So that's in a lot of Mormons' DNA of how they view the world, and maybe it helps.
Mm-hmm. Well, as a non-Mormon, I guess I would say this. There are divisions in this community along religious lines. And I'm sorry to say that I see it much more intensely felt. Maybe it's because it's a minority opinion and expressed by non-Mormons than Mormons. I find Mormons generally are more inclusive. And I'm generalizing, and I mean it to apply to small segments of our community, because I think that's really where it lies. Overall, people in this community, I think, welcome dialogue and differences of opinion. And while we may go to different churches, and that sometimes creates different social environments, when it comes to our interactions socially, out in our secular worlds, I don't find it an issue. In fact, I will say to the contrary. As a mayor, and again, discussing my conditions in my city, where obviously the Mormon Church is the dominant property owner and the largest institution in the community, they could only dream of having the kind of relationship with the largest institution that I had with the LDS Church. When I would go in and meet with leadership in the LDS Church, the first question was almost, how can we help you? Now, when that does not happen, usually with large businesses. Large business is there, and they've got a primary objective, which is to make a good return on whatever they're investing in or whatever they're doing. And they're always trying to leverage government, whether it's trying to get a tax incentive or help with infrastructure costs or whatever it may be. That never happens. In fact, it is abhorrent to the LDS Church to get any sort of a break. So when they spent $1.5 billion plus, we'll never know how much it really was, to build right through the recession, the largest development, the only major multi-use development in this country, in the heart of the city, and do it in a way that was of top-notch quality, and to take the time to do it right. Most folks, they'd come to the city and say, we want to break on this, we want to break on that, we want you to do this. never asked a thing of the city beyond what any person coming to get a permit or coming to invest in the city would ask for, which was fair consideration, review of their plans, and feedback, and meeting whatever the requirements were. So in my mind, that sort of experience tells me, hey, you know, we're going to have divisions. Every community has its divisions and its dominant institutions. But it is an incredibly potent and positive effect in our community that we have a church, and a church that obviously cares for a whole variety of reasons about its home city, as the large institution, and the fact that they're LDS. It wouldn't matter if it was Rome. I would hope that the Vatican would treat Rome the same way, and I don't know.
That's quite a compliment. Thank you. As we move towards the end of the session, did you want to say something, Wayne?
Yeah, just let me, I grew up in northern Utah. I've lived here all my life, and I'm of the dominant faith here, LDS also. But from a child, I was taught to respect. That was the doctrine of the church. Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemingly, seeketh not her own. Is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. That's what I was taught as a child. Now, have I exhibited that always? No. And when I hear of people complaining about Mormons because they haven't been inclusive, it isn't because they haven't been taught to be inclusive. Because we have been taught. And I grew up and I went on a mission to Florida years ago. Had left the state maybe twice before that, before I was 19 years old. Very rarely got out of Cache Valley, a little farming community up north. And, Utah State's there, Utah State University. But when I got outside of the environment here, and yes, we are a pretty homogeneous population, okay? I accept that. But to see some of the divisions with people in other areas of the country because of race or something else, I wasn't used to that where I grew up. Mm-hmm. Even though we were a pretty homogeneous population, I didn't have those same prejudice. And I'd been taught not to do that, but I had never been really exposed to a lot of that. And so I was taken back in a lot of ways. And so I think a lot of what we've done here does springboard from that faith, mm-hmm. the way we were taught, okay? And not necessarily the way we exhibit what we're taught, because I don't think there's any soul out there that exhibits the best of everything always, because we're humans. But I believe it springboards from a lot of what I grew up with and the fundamentals and foundation that was laid before me.
Thank you. Please, Eden.
As a Muslim and also working for Catholic organization and working a lot with the LDS, folks, I think that word, how can we help you? I hear that all the time. Especially the work that we do, all the refugees that we bring in, every single bed that they sleep with comes from the LDS Church. That support never wavered from the LDS Church. And also, as a Muslim, when 9/11 happened, where the Muslims were going through a lot of challenges in the United States, the first person that reached to us at our mosque was the leadership from the LDS Church and said, "We here with you. We here to support you. If one religion is attacked, all religion is attacked." I hear that phrase so many times, and it gives me a lot of comfort to leave this community. That's why I live here in Utah, because knowingly that our Mormon friends would always stood with us when there is anything happen to any one of us in this community, and I've never felt that I'm in the minority here.
Beautiful. Well, this is so moving to me. I want to ask you, as we move towards the end of this, towards the close of this part of this panel, I'd like to just ask you about what you have learned. I'm sure all of us are here today, and probably people listening live stream are here because they want to learn something, and they probably want to learn something about reaching out across the divide. And I'm wondering if each of you could close this panel by just sharing either a personal experience or a personal learning. What have you learned about this challenge of dealing with difference and crossing the divide? What have you learned that you think, if you're passing it on to your kids, or you were talking to a group and you say, and they said, what have you learned about how to do that? What's the main lesson, the main teaching that you'd want to pass on?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. Use these more than this. And seek first to understand, then to be understood. I think if we can all take that kind of approach, I think we'd have a lot less division and divisiveness, and just a good dose of respect, and knowing that there are differences of opinion, and not necessarily having to agree with those, but at least respecting that someone can have that opinion.
That's that line that you use, seek first to understand and then be understood. Let's just credit it properly. It's one of the 7 habits of highly effective people. From
I should have given the
Great, you, Tom.
citation. I'm
but
sorry.
from Stephen
I'm
Covey.
not trying to plagiarize it, by
I
the
know.
way.
No, but from Stephen Covey, who was both a Utah, a Mormon, and a Republican, and a truly fine man. If you haven't read 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I would like you to send one to the White House, please. Other comments about what you've learned? What have you learned?
So I'm going to try to keep my emotions intact here, and I think I can do that. But I'm going to use the saying to own your emotions. So the pain for me in this election cycle has really come from being a woman. And my sensibilities were violated. And it's not just the person we put in office, but it's that so many of my fellow citizens didn't feel that violation. And so, and for me it's hard because I do a few things publicly in this state, and sometimes it's kind of hard to speak out because you don't want to offend, and I'm going against my party here and different things, but I feel in this case like I really need to own my emotions and feel comfortable to say that this was unacceptable to me.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to say this saying, the triumph of an evil is for good people not to do nothing. I think we all watched of what was happening, and whether we agree or not, I think we need to say that this is not all right, and reach out to the people that have been hurt. Because when I heard so many things that was said in this election, I felt hurt. So as many other people, and yet we're not seeing people reaching out to us or coming to the media saying, this was not right. And I think we need to reach out to other people and say, hey, especially those that are hurt. Especially, we were waiting our leaders to come out and say, this is not okay, and we're sorry. Sometimes, politicians don't say sorry when they say something, right? But we have to hold them accountable, whatever they say, until we see their actions. So those are the things that are still circling in my mind, and until I see the actions, I'm not going to believe anybody.
So on behalf of at least some other politicians, we're sorry. This whole year almost feels like it's been a horror movie. And I've got to say, for me, it was almost the sequel of last year, because I felt like I went through this experience last year in my own re-election effort. And I felt that from the very beginning of this year. It was oh, I know what this is. I think long before anyone believed Trump could have the success that he had, I was seeing the potential for it. And I know others were as well. I think back to work that I did in my career, and much of it was in rural Utah. And when you come from the Wasatch Front, from the urban area, and you go to rural Utah, it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican. It's all right. What do you want? People don't come down here to invite a discussion or to find out what we want. It's to make a courtesy visit or to go visit the national parks or the beauty of our area, and they're so fed up with the federal government or whatever it may be that the first encounter is almost always one of hostility and being okay, we'll put up with you. Sort of that combination of circumstances. I'm sure you felt that when you've gone to as well. It's not a Democrat or Republican thing, I don't think. But because of the kind of work that I was doing, going back to the time I worked for Governor Matheson in the 80s, and then throughout my career working with rural communities and counties, what I found was that if I didn't come in and leave and not come back, and if I didn't come in and try to tell people what I thought their answers were, that changed. People would get to know you, and they'd realize you weren't trying to achieve some agenda for anyone else but for them, and you were bringing a professional service to them, and they would start to accept you, and then pretty soon they start to adopt you. In fact, there were times when I'd be in a community, sometimes for a year or two, and someone would come up to me and go, "You're not Mormon?" And then when they found out after getting elected to the legislature that I was a Democrat, I literally had to make special visits. It's like, hey, I'm still the same person, really. But I think what I learned coming out of this election is that it's really what we're hearing people say. We've got to listen to each other. We've got to respect each other. We have to form at the individual level and the community level and the state level the civil dialogue that then creates the model of what hopefully could happen at the federal level. It isn't going to happen. At least I'll be shocked because the same people are in place at the national level. It is going to happen from us taking hold of our lives and our communities and our states and having the kind of dialogue that produces the outcomes we want. Because we haven't been getting it, I don't think, this past year, certainly at the national level. And I think we can do that. And I know from what I've been hearing and participating and observing all day, I know we can do that. And if we can do it in Utah and other states and communities around the country, which I know can happen, because this kind of thing is going on spontaneously in other places. And we've got to build on that and find a way to network it.
Thank you. What an incredible panel. I leave this panel with great hope, great energy, and glad I flew across the Rocky Mountains to learn from Utah and want to bring some of it back to Colorado. So thank you all. You've been fantastic.